Okay, let's dive into something that's really shaping the global economic landscape right now. U.S. trade policy, specifically this whole thing with tariffs. And the big question a lot of people are asking, is this pushing us towards, like, a global trade war?
It's definitely a major concern.
So our mission today is to really unpack the analysis presented in the source material you brought us. Gives a pretty detailed look at Donald Trump's tariff policies and, crucially, their potential ripple effects across the globe.
Yeah, it tries to connect a lot of dots.
And this deep dive, it isn't just focused on the U.S. and China, though obviously that's a huge part of it. The analysis also digs into the impact on other key trading partners, Mexico, Canada, India, for instance. We'll get into the debate the source highlights about whether tariffs actually, work.
Right, the effectiveness question.
And importantly, look at some broader systemic economic issues that the source connects all of this to.
Which is key to understanding the bigger picture.
So yeah, get ready, because this isn't just about policy details. It's really about trying to grasp the potential economic fallout and these shifting global power dynamics that the source material lays out.
Absolutely. It's a critical topic, and digging into analysis like this helps see the layers, the complexity.
So where does the source suggest we start? It frames it within the U.S. perception of China's rise.
Oh.
Right. Sets some historical context.
Exactly. That seems like the logical starting point, the U.S. view of China.
Okay. So the source sets the scene by explaining that the U.S., sort of seeing itself as the dominant global power for a long time, views China's economic rise as a direct challenge. Maybe is a bit reluctant to accept a rival of that scale.
A fundamental challenge to its position, yeah.
And takes us way back to the 1970s. Describes China as largely impoverished back then.
A very different economic picture.
And it brings up this interesting historical point from the Cold War, U.S. strategy of using economic incentives. Things like access to Western capital, tech, markets, specifically to try and drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China. The source even suggests this strategy played a part in the Soviet Union's collapse.
That's a significant claim it makes, linking those policies to that outcome.
So, connecting that history to now, the source argues that Trump's Make America Great Again agenda, with its tariff focus, isn't happening in isolation. It's unfolding in a global economy marked by, well, stagnating demand.
Stagnation, yeah.
And it links this stagnation to what it calls globalized finance capital, basically. Money moving freely across borders, seeking the best return. And this capital, the source says, tends to resist things like government deficits or higher taxes on the wealthy.
And this is a critical connection the source makes. It suggests Trump's tariff policies landing in this environment are likely to make things worse.
Worse how?
Well, according to the analysis, they could exacerbate this broader capitalist crisis we're seeing globally. The potential outcome, maybe rapid inflation, intensifying trade wars.
And the source points out who gets hit hardest.
It highlights that the impact will likely fall disproportionately on countries in the global south. That's a key part of its argument.
Okay, so let's break down the tool itself. Tariffs. The source defines them pretty simply, right? A tax on imports.
Yeah, fundamentally that's what they are. A tax at the border.
And what's the intended goal? What does the source say they're supposed to achieve?
Well, the stated goal, as the source describes it, is usually things like encouraging domestic production, trying to create jobs at home, and reducing how much a country relies on foreign suppliers.
I'm bringing manufacturing back.
That's the idea, yeah. Reshoring or nearshoring.
But here's the debate the source flags. Is their effectiveness a sure thing? Does the analysis think tariffs alone are the magic bullet for reindustrializing the U.S.?
No, the source expresses a pretty significant doubt on that front. It argues tariffs by themselves probably won't lead to this big industrial comeback in the U.S.
Why not?
Because, the analysis points out, for decades, U.S. industries have been moving operations not just to China, but other places in East Asia too.
Yeah.
Primarily chasing lower wages and what the source calls more disciplined labor forces, which often means fewer protections or unions. So tariffs don't just undo all that history overnight.
Yeah, makes sense. It's not just about cost parity. So what else does the source say is needed for real industrial revitalization, beyond just slapping taxes on imports?
That's a crucial point in the analysis. It argues you need a whole package. Competitive wages, yes, but also a skilled workforce ready for those jobs, and critically, high enough returns on investment to actually lure capital back to the U.S. and persuade it to stay there.
So tariffs are just one piece, maybe not even the most important one according to this view.
Potentially, yes. The source seems to imply that without these other factors, tariffs might just shuffle things around or raise costs without fundamentally changing the industrial base.
And the source draws an interesting comparison here, even between Trump and Biden, right? Despite the different approaches.
It does. It notes that while Trump talked a lot about reindustrialization via his agenda, the analysis points to Biden implementing more concrete industrial policies, like the GATS Act.
Yes, the semiconductor funding.
Exactly. That act provided subsidies for semiconductor manufacturers, but, and this is key, it came with strings attached, like restrictions on recipients producing cutting-edge chips in rival countries, specifically mentioning China.
So different tactics, perhaps, but a similar underlying goal related to China's tech.
That's what the analysis suggests. A continuity in trying to contain China's technological advancement, even if the tools, like direct subsidies versus just tariffs, differ.
Okay, let's really dig into the core of this, the U.S.-China rivalry. The source portrays this as a major shift in global power.
Absolutely central to the whole analysis.
It traces how the U.S. approach has kind of evolved.
Right.
It says Obama started the conversation about, containing China's rise.
Laid some groundwork, perhaps.
Then Trump accelerated things dramatically with tariffs. And Biden, despite criticizing Trump's methods, has largely kept those tariffs in place.
Maintained them, yeah, and even added his own restrictions. The source mentions things like electric vehicles, solar cells, semiconductor chips. It's pretty explicit that the source sees the Biden administration viewing China as the primary geopolitical rival.
Right. And the source describes this historical strategy used by big U.S. and European companies.
This is multinationals, yeah.
They basically saw China as this huge source of low-cost labor and materials, a way to maximize profits by outsourcing the manufacturing part.
Standard globalization playbook, in a way.
While keeping the higher value stuff like design, R&D, innovation back home where they could lock in bigger monopoly-style profits. The low-value, high-competition assembly work, that was left to China and other emerging economies.
And the source notes this did benefit Western consumers, right? Lower prices.
Right.
And obviously boosted corporate profits through cost savings.
Yeah, a win-win from that perspective. But the source highlights a catch, a key assumption they made.
Right. These big corporations tried hard to restrict technology transfer. They didn't want to give away the secret sauce, basically.
Fearing it would erode their advantage.
Exactly. The assumption, the source argues, was that China would sort of stay in its lane, focused on that low-value production.
But that's not how it played out.
Not according to this analysis, no. It argues China just advanced incredibly rapidly, technologically, industrially. Productivity shot up way faster than anticipated.
And the result of that?
The source states that Western elites now see this as a major fundamental threat. A threat to what they perceive as their long-standing dominance over global resources. A dominance the source claims has lasted nearly 4 centuries.
4 centuries, wow. So the source is framing this as much bigger than just trade deficits. It's about a challenge to a really long-term global power structure.
That's exactly the argument. It connects China's rise directly to the world shifting towards multipolarity. Multiple centers of power, not just one.
And the U.S. response, the tariffs, the tech restrictions.
According to the source, those are all part of an effort to curtail China's access to cutting-edge tech and stop it from becoming a fully independent economic powerhouse, because that rise is seen as an existential threat to that historical dominance.
Okay, so that leads us to a really central argument in the analysis. The idea that this U.S. protectionism might actually backfire, be self-defeating. Why does this source think that?
Well, the argument hinges on China's current economic reality. The source says China has become a crucial low-cost producer of the cutting-edge tech the world needs.
Examples.
It points to things like BYD and electric vehicles, DeepSeek and AI, advancements in 5G, basically saying China is now a leader, or at least highly competitive, in key future industries.
Okay.
So the irony, the source suggests, is that U.S. policies trying to isolate or weaken China might actually strengthen it by pushing it into closer relationships with other countries who still want or need that technology. Instead of containment, it could lead to new alliances.
And the source brings up some points about China's inherent strengths to back this up.
It does. It mentions purchasing power parity, or PPP. In those terms, what money actually buys locally, China's economy is already bigger than the U.S. economy.
Right, PPP versus nominal GDP.
Exactly. And then there's population nearly 4 times the U.S., That's a huge long-term demographic advantage, the source notes. Plus, China's annual economic growth rate, while slowing, still outpaces the U.S.
What about China's relationships with other parts of the world, the global south?
Yeah, the analysis discusses that too. It observes that many developing countries are actively seeking closer economic ties with China. They want access to its innovation, its manufacturing capabilities.
And this undermines the U.S. strategy.
The source argues yes, because it shows the U.S. containment strategy doesn't have broad global buy-in outside of its traditional Western allies. Many countries see more benefit in engaging with China.
Interesting. The source also briefly mentions AI, noting some risks.
Just briefly, yeah. It flags the potential risks identified in the analysis, things like AI concentrating corporate power, enabling more surveillance, and accelerating militarization through autonomous weapons, which could reduce human control over warfare. A worrying tangent.
Definitely. Now, the source makes a comparison between this U.S.-China situation and the old U.S.-Soviet Cold War. What's the key difference it highlights?
That's a really important distinction it draws. It argues the Soviet Union was primarily a military rival. It was never really an economic competitor on the same scale.
Okay.
China, however, is presented as a genuine economic powerhouse, thanks to its industrialization, its tech progress. It's a different kind of challenge altogether, even if militarily it's still considered weaker than the U.S.
So the source frames this as a new Cold War, but with economics at its very core.
Exactly. An economic Cold War, perhaps.
And does the analysis provide details to support this idea of a different rivalry?
It does offer some supporting points. It highlights the U.S. military footprint around 750 bases worldwide, 200 in Asia, kind of encircling China, contrasted with China having no overseas military bases.
A stark difference in military posture.
Yes. And it also mentions China developing alternatives to the U.S.-dominated SWIFT international payment system, offering options for countries wanting to trade outside the dollar system.
By building parallel structures.
And it touches on Taiwan, too. Contrasting the U.S. historical stance, Nixon recognizing the One China policy in '72, Clinton supporting WTO entry with the current tensions.
Fidoma links that shift too.
It links the shift in the U.S. position directly to China's growing technological strength and its increasing share in high-tech industries, which the U.S. now sees as a threat to its own dominance, its hegemony.
Finally, on this comparison, the source points out a fundamental difference in their economic systems.
Yes. It contrasts the U.S. system, where capitalist banks allocate investment based mainly on private profit motives, with China, where the government controls the central bank and directly guides investment towards long-term strategic goals.
Giving China more direct control over its economic direction.
That's the argument the source makes a political advantage in shaping its economic trajectory.
Okay, so shifting focus a bit. Beyond just the U.S.-China dynamic, the source examines the potential ripple effects, the unintended consequences of these U.S. tariffs for other countries, and maybe even for the U.S. itself. Let's start with Mexico.
Right. Mexico is a key example in the analysis because it's so incredibly dependent on the U.S. market.
How dependent?
The source states about 80% of Mexico's total exports go to the U.S.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. The source shares some 2024 trade stats. U.S. imported $558 billion from Mexico, exported $334 billion back. That's a $178 billion trade deficit for the U.S. in Mexico's favor.
So if the U.S. imposes significant tariffs,
Mexico has already threatened to retaliate. The source says they'd target specific U.S. sectors. Agriculture, automotive, electronics. And importantly, it notes there's already pushback within the U.S. from automakers and farm lobby groups.
why? What are their concerns?
They fear tariffs would just mean higher costs for parts or ingredients, which would ultimately hit U.S. consumers through higher prices and potentially fuel inflation.
Makes sense. And China is also retaliating.
The analysis points out China has decided to hit back against U.S. tariffs too, suggesting this tit-for-tat could further damage the American economy. It also notes a U.S. tendency, according to the source, to try and eliminate competition in industries where it has near monopoly power.
Okay, what about India? The source mentions significant trade there too.
Yes, around $125 billion in bilateral trade. The source breaks down the current tariff situation. Average U.S. imports from India face a 2.8% tariff, but U.S. exports going to India face a higher 7.7% average tariff.
So there's already an imbalance there.
Right. And if the U.S. were to impose new tariffs, the source estimates it would add about 4.9% to the cost of Indian goods entering the U.S. And if India retaliates, that could add another 4.9% cost onto those goods.
And does the source detail which specific sectors in India and the U.S. would feel the pain?
It does. For India, it flags a big potential impact on agriculture, specifically small and family farms. The source raises the concern that removing trade barriers could allow heavily subsidized U.S. agribusiness unrestricted access, potentially leading to widespread impoverishment, given that something like 45% of India's population works in agriculture.
A huge social risk there.
Definitely. And for U.S. imports from India that could be affected, the source lists things like auto parts, processed foods, meat, diamonds, gold jewelry, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. Quite a range.
So looking more broadly, what's the general economic fallout the source describes from tariffs like these?
Well, the basic mechanism is that tariffs raise the cost of imports. And for many goods, demand is price sensitive, so higher prices mean people buy less.
Simply economic.
Pretty much. The source also makes the point again about U.S. agriculture benefiting from heavy government subsidies, which allows its large corporations to compete very aggressively on the global stage, potentially distorting markets.
The source also talks about a shift in the U.S. economic narrative, right?
Yeah.
Moving away from one idea towards another.
Yes, it characterizes it as a shift away from the sort of neoliberal consensus, the idea that unrestricted free trade is always beneficial for everyone. Towards a new discourse of protectionism. And the source says this new approach has echoes of older ideas, colonial economic dominance even. It mentions historical examples or mindsets related to control over places like Panama, Greenland, Canada.
So framing it as a return to a more overtly dominance-focused approach.
That's the interpretation the source offers, yes.
And the concrete consequences of this shift, according to the analysis.
Higher production costs for businesses using imported components, which inevitably get passed on to consumers. Increased uncertainty in global supply chains, making planning harder, and generally disrupting trade relationships.
And it circles back to that idea of Western companies expecting to keep the high-value stuff.
Exactly. That historical expectation that the West controls the profitable R&D and design, while developing countries do the low-margin assembly. China's successful challenge to that model, the source argues, is viewed as this existential threat to, again, those nearly 4 centuries of Western control over global resources. It sees the U.S. reacting to the perceived end of its unchallenged global supremacy.
Let's put some numbers on these relationships. The source highlights specific trade data.
It does.
Yeah.
It notes that in 2024, looking at U.S. imports, Mexico accounted for 15%, Canada 14%, and China 14%.
So those three together are almost half.
Pretty much. Nearly half of all U.S. imports coming from just those 3 countries. Significant concentration.
But the source draws a really sharp contrast in terms of dependence between them.
A very sharp contrast. As we said, Mexico sends about 80% of its exports to the U.S. Canada sends 78%. Their economies are deeply tied to the U.S. market.
Okay. And China?
China, in stark contrast, sends only about 15% of its total exports to the U.S. The other 85% goes elsewhere around the world.
So China is much less reliant on the U.S. market.
Much less reliant. The source presents this as evidence that China has successfully diversified its export markets, reducing its vulnerability to U.S. trade policy compared to Mexico or Canada.
That's a key strategic difference.
Yeah.
The course also includes U.S.-EU trade data for 2024.
Yes, it shows the EU exported significantly more to the U.S., about $606 billion than the U.S. exported to the EU, which was around $370 billion, resulting in a large trade surplus for the EU with the U.S.
And the source dives specifically into the U.S.-Canada agricultural trade.
It does, highlighting just how integrated that sector is, thanks to NAFTA and now the USMCA. It gives 2023 stats. Canada's global agri-exports were around $69 billion, imports $48 billion.
And the U.S. role.
The U.S. is Canada's biggest partner by far, takes over 60% of Canada's agri-exports, supplies over 56% of its agri-imports, and Canada is vital for the U.S. too, takes over 16% of U.S. agri-exports, supplies over 20% of U.S. agri-imports.
So NAFTA and USMCA kept that trade flowing.
The source says NAFTA eliminated most tariffs, and USMCA largely preserved that free trade, even expanding U.S. access to some protected Canadian markets like dairy, poultry, and eggs. It even notes continued strong growth in that two-way agri-trade under USMCA in 2023.
Okay, so tariffs might bring in some government revenue. But what's the source's take on the overall cost-benefit analysis?
It acknowledges the potential revenue may be around $100 billion a year for the federal government. But, the analysis argues, this comes at a significant cost to the wider economy.
Such as?
Disrupting supply chains, raising costs for businesses that rely on imports, potentially leading to job losses. The source mentions figures like hundreds of thousands of jobs, and ultimately driving up prices for U.S. consumers. The conclusion drawn is that the economic costs likely outweigh the revenue gains.
Let's shift now to the source's view on U.S. manufacturing itself and why it thinks protectionism might have limits in bringing it back. Yeah, it points to a long-term employment trend.
A very clear trend, yeah. It shows U.S. manufacturing employment peaked way back in June 1979, and by January 2025, it had dropped by 35%.
A massive decline.
Yeah.
More than a third of the workforce gone.
Huge.
And the source challenges the common narrative about why that happened. It wasn't just jobs going overseas.
Right. While offshoring, moving jobs abroad, definitely played a role, the analysis argues that the primary drivers were actually domestic. Things like huge gains in productivity, increased automation, robots, labor-saving technologies being adopted within the U.S.
So factories producing more with fewer people.
Exactly. And that's a crucial insight from the source, because if automation is a primary driver, then just blocking imports won't automatically bring back millions of those old jobs.
Right. So given that context, automation being key, the source is skeptical that simply imposing tariffs on goods from China, India, or the EU will be enough to truly revitalize U.S. industry.
Yes, very skeptical.
Yeah.
And it lays out several specific reasons why protectionism alone has limits.
What's the first one?
First, it argues protectionism isn't very effective unless you also regulate finance. The source points out that despite all the tariff talk, there haven't really been serious proposals to restrict the free movement of international finance capital. Meaning, corporations can still easily move money offshore to chase higher returns where production costs are lower, regardless of tariffs on finished goods. Capital flight remains easy.
So the money will just follow the lowest costs anyway.
That's the source's argument. Second, it notes that tariffs don't actually make the domestic market bigger. They might shift who produces for that market, maybe from imports to domestic firms, but they don't increase overall demand within the U.S. economy.
So you're just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, maybe.
That's one way to put it, yeah. The source argues that for real economic growth, you need policies that do expand the market, like increased government spending, which requires either bigger deficits or higher taxes on the wealthy.
And
Ultimately, the source concludes that tackling decades of deindustrialization needs a lot more than just tariffs. It requires a coordinated approach. Serious industrial policy, direct investment, major workforce retraining programs, and fiscal stimulus to actually boost demand. Tariffs are too blunt an instrument on their own.
This really leads us into the broader economic and systemic issues the source connects all this to. It ties the tariff debate into bigger trends in capitalism. What's its final verdict on Trump's mercantilist trade strategy?
It's pretty blunt. The source concludes the strategy is unlikely to succeed. It argues tariffs alone just can't restore manufacturing because they ignore all those crucial factors we just discussed. Industrial policy, wages, productivity, exchange rates, the need for a skilled workforce.
And the risks of trying anyway.
The source warns of significant risks, triggering retaliation, sparking sharp price increases, disrupting supply chains, potentially causing a deeper economic crisis that could even spiral into full-blown trade wars. And all of this, it argues, would just exacerbate the existing global capitalist crisis.
The source also brings up the internationalization of capital again, complicating things.
Yes. It notes how money flowing globally complicates the relationship between governments, corporations, and financial markets. Governments have less control. And it references Marx, arguing this leads to more concentration and centralization of capital, basically strengthening the power of big multinational corporations and worsening inequality.
It paints a fairly grim picture of where capitalism is currently at, doesn't it?
It does. The source argues the old era of somewhat predictable boom and bubble cycles might be over. It suggests that since the 2008 financial crisis, we've entered a period of long-term stagnation.
Characterized by
sluggish growth, persistent unemployment or underemployment, stagnant wages for most people, and dramatically widening gaps in income and wealth.
And it even makes a historical callback to Rosa Luxemburg.
Yes, quite dramatically. It references Luxemburg's warning from over a century ago that capitalism's path would eventually force humanity to choose between socialism or barbarism.
And the source sees that as relevant now.
Disturbingly relevant is the implication. It suggests that the current phase, neoliberal capitalism, has not only hit a dead end, but has also actively fueled the rise of what it calls pervasive neo-fascism around the world.
Wow. So what path forward does the source suggest, if any?
The analysis suggests a need to fundamentally reverse inequality, create meaningful employment, and boost productivity. It floats ideas like using publicly owned enterprises that have democratic accountability. And crucially, it argues for bringing multinational corporations and financial oligarchies under control to address what it sees as a deep systemic crisis.
It also talks about a lack of investment drivers.
Yeah, it argues that without big drivers like major tech breakthroughs that aren't just about automation or large-scale government spending programs, modern economies have increasingly turned to financialization, making money from money to generate profits.
Instead of investing
that surplus back into productive industries that create jobs and tangible goods. This channels money into speculation, the source argues, which just worsens inequality and makes the system more unstable.
And finally, the source levels some criticism at global financial institutions. IMF, World Bank, WTO.
Yes, it points out what it sees as hypocrisy and selective enforcement.
How so?
It notes these institutions are often silent when the U.S. uses protectionist measures, but they simultaneously pressure countries in the global south to stick rigidly to free trade rules and limit government spending. The source also highlights their opposition to taxing the wealthy, claiming it deters investment, which the analysis sees as evidence of a structural bias favoring financial elites over fair global development.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive into the source material you shared. We've covered a lot of ground.
We certainly have.
The complexities of U.S. tariff policy, the whole historical backdrop of the U.S.-China rivalry, that debate on whether tariffs alone are really effective.
The potential for them backfire.
Right. The self-defeating aspect, the impacts on other countries like Mexico, Canada, India, and then connecting it all into these bigger global economic shifts, the decline in U.S. manufacturing, and those deep systemic issues within capitalism that the source highlights.
It's all interconnected in this analysis.
Hopefully exploring the analysis from this source gives you, our listener, a clearer picture of just how intricate these global economic dynamics are and the powerful forces shaping them.
Absolutely. And perhaps a final thought to leave you with, drawing from the source material. It clearly argues that these challenges aren't just about specific trade policies. They signal something deeper, like a potential structural crisis in the whole global economic order, and this ongoing, maybe messy shift towards a multipolar world. So the provocative question the source implicitly raises is, as these large systemic forces continue to play out, what are the real-world implications for you? What will this transition to a multipolar world, as described in the source, actually look like on the ground? Something to think about.